Part 1. Too lazy to garden? Good. Because honestly, most people are not failing at gardening because they are bad at it. They are failing because modern life is exhausting. You buy the gloves. You save the inspiration photos. You spend an entire weekend planting flowers that looked perfect at the nursery. Then life happens. Work gets busy. The weather gets weird. You forget to water for a week. Then another week. And suddenly half the garden looks like it lost the will to live. That cycle discourages a lot of people from gardening completely. And I understand why. For years, that was me too. Every spring started with excitement and ended with crispy leaves, empty containers, and guilt every time I walked past my dying flower beds. But eventually, I learned something that changed the way I garden forever. Beautiful gardens are not built by working harder. They are built by choosing smarter plants, because some plants genuinely want to survive. Some plants actually prefer neglect. Some thrive in poor soil, heat, drought, shade, freezing winters, and inconsistent watering without complaining at all. And once those plants establish themselves, the entire garden changes. It becomes calmer, easier, more forgiving. Instead of constantly replacing dead flowers, you start watching the landscape slowly improve on its own every single year. Pollinators return automatically. The plants grow larger. The borders fill in naturally. The garden starts feeling alive instead of temporary. Today, I am giving you some of the best low-maintenance perennials for people who want a gorgeous yard without turning gardening into a second full-time job. These are plants that survive real life, busy schedules, forgetful watering, bad soil, extreme weather. Some of them bloom for months. Some spread beautifully on their own. Some create structure and color even in winter. And a few are so durable they are almost impossible to kill. By the end of this video, you are going to know exactly which plants work best for shade, drought, pollinators, structure, ground cover, and effortless long-term beauty. And honestly, even if you only plant 3 from this list, your garden is probably going to look dramatically better a year from now. So let's start with one of the easiest solutions for those frustrating shady areas where almost nothing else seems happy. Part 2. If you have a shady corner in your yard that feels impossible to fix, hostas are about to become your best friend. Because while most flowering plants struggle in shade, hostas seem completely unbothered by it. In fact, many varieties actually prefer it. And once mature, they create some of the boldest, richest foliage textures in all of gardening. Hostas are grown primarily for their leaves, and those leaves can be spectacular. Deep forest green, blue-green, golden chartreuse, bright white and green variegation. Some varieties stay compact and tidy, while others spread several feet wide and become the centerpiece of an entire shade bed. The texture alone changes a garden instantly. Large, dramatic leaves make shaded spaces feel intentional instead of empty. That is why hostas are used constantly in professional landscape design. They solve difficult areas beautifully. And unlike high-maintenance flowers that demand constant attention, hostas are surprisingly forgiving once established. They return every year larger and fuller than before. They tolerate occasional drought much better than most people expect. And aside from watering during their first establishment season, they are almost completely hands-off. Plant them once and let them do their thing. That is the magic. Hostas grow best in partial shade to full shade with rich, well-draining soil, although they adapt to average garden conditions remarkably well. USDA hardiness zones 3 through 9 also make them reliable across most of the country, from cold northern winters to hot southern summers. But there is one thing hostas genuinely hate: harsh afternoon sun. Too much direct heat can scorch the leaves, especially lighter-colored varieties. Morning sun is usually fine. Hot afternoon exposure is where problems begin. And visually, few combinations work better than layering different hosta varieties together. Large blue-green leaves beside smaller variegated forms create depth and contrast even without flowers. That is another secret experienced gardeners understand. A beautiful garden is not built only with blooms. Strong foliage matters just as much. And perhaps the best part of hostas is how peaceful they make a space feel. Cool shade, dense leaves, soft movement after rain, They transform difficult forgotten corners into some of the calmest parts of the entire garden. Part 3. Astilbe looks like something that should be difficult to grow. The flowers are soft, feathery, almost cloud-like, rising above the foliage in shades of pink, white, lavender, and deep red. It has that elegant, high-maintenance garden plant appearance. But surprisingly, Astilbe is much easier to grow than it looks, especially if you have shade, because while many flowering perennials struggle without strong sunlight, Astilbe absolutely thrives in cooler shaded conditions where other plants often fail completely. Under mature trees, north-facing beds, along shaded pathways, these are the places where Astilbe shines. And when it blooms in early to mid-summer, the effect is stunning. The flower plumes rise above the foliage like soft fireworks frozen in motion, bringing color and texture into parts of the garden that are usually dominated by plain green leaves. That contrast matters. Shade gardens can sometimes feel flat visually. Astilbe changes that immediately. And unlike delicate annual flowers that disappear after one season, Astilbe returns larger and fuller every year once established. Plant a few different varieties with staggered bloom times, and you can keep color flowing through shaded areas for weeks longer than most gardeners expect. It grows best in partial shade with moist, rich soil that drains well without drying out completely. This is one of the few plants on today's list that genuinely appreciates consistent moisture, especially during hot weather. If hostas are forgiving about occasional neglect, Astilbe prefers a little more regular watering. But beyond that, it asks for very little. No complicated pruning, no constant fertilizing, no obsessive maintenance routine, just reasonable moisture and protection from harsh afternoon sun. USDA hardiness zones 3 through 8 make Astilbe especially valuable in cooler northern climates, where summers are milder and moisture levels stay more consistent naturally. And visually, Astilbe pairs beautifully with hostas and ferns. The bold, broad hosta leaves create structure, while Astilbe adds softness and vertical movement above them. That layering effect makes shade gardens feel rich and intentional instead of empty or forgotten. And emotionally, Astilbe does something many shade plants struggle to achieve. It brings excitement into darker spaces. Suddenly, the coolest, quietest part of the yard becomes one of the most beautiful areas in the entire garden. Part 4. Liriope may not be the flashiest plant on this list, but it might be one of the most useful, because this plant solves problems. The dry area under trees where grass refuses to grow, the steep slope that keeps eroding after heavy rain, the narrow border along a walkway that constantly fills with weeds. Liriope handles all of it with almost no drama whatsoever. Also called lily turf, Liriope forms dense clumps of dark green arching foliage that looks similar to ornamental grass, although technically it is a flowering perennial. And once established, it becomes one of the easiest low-maintenance ground covers you can grow. It spreads slowly into thick, weed-suppressing mats that help stabilize soil, reduce erosion, and fill difficult empty spaces without needing constant attention. That alone makes it incredibly valuable in real-world gardens. But it also looks good doing it. In late summer, spikes of small purple or white flowers rise above the foliage, followed by dark, berry-like fruits that add another layer of seasonal interest. And in warmer climates, the foliage often stays evergreen through winter, continuing to provide structure and color long after other plants disappear completely. Liriope is also remarkably adaptable. Full sun, partial shade, deep shade, compacted soil, dry conditions, humidity. It tolerates all of it far better than most ornamental plants. That flexibility is exactly why landscape designers use it so heavily around foundations, pathways, parking areas, and beneath mature trees where other plants constantly struggle. USDA hardiness zones 5 through 10 make it especially useful across the South and Mid-Atlantic regions, although it performs beautifully in many cooler areas as well. And once mature, maintenance becomes incredibly simple. Cut the foliage back once in late winter or early spring, before fresh growth begins emerging. That is basically the entire yearly job. No constant pruning, No deadheading, no babysitting. And visually, Liriope works best when used in repetition. Large drifts along pathways, mass plantings beneath trees, soft borders around patios or beds. It creates that clean, intentional, designed landscape feeling without requiring expensive maintenance to keep it looking polished. That balance between usefulness and beauty is exactly what makes certain plants so valuable long-term. They quietly make the entire garden easier to manage year after year. Part 5. Black-eyed Susan is the kind of plant that makes beginner gardeners feel successful immediately, because it is unbelievably hard to mess up. This flower survives heat, drought, poor soil, neglect, and inconsistent watering better than most plants. People spend 10 times more money trying to grow. And somehow, despite all that toughness, it still looks bright, cheerful, and full of life for months at a time. Black-eyed Susans produce vivid golden yellow petals surrounding a deep, dark center that almost glows under summer sunlight. You have probably seen them growing wild along roadsides, in open fields, and beside fences all across North America. That is not an accident. These plants evolved to survive real conditions without human help, which is exactly why they work so beautifully in low-maintenance gardens. Once established, black-eyed Susans are extremely drought-tolerant and bloom heavily from midsummer all the way into fall. July, August, September, sometimes even October. That bloom season is far longer than many gardeners expect from such an easy perennial. And while they are blooming, pollinators arrive constantly. Butterflies drift through the flowers. Bees cover them throughout warm afternoons. The garden immediately feels more alive. But one of the best things about black-eyed Susan happens after the flowers fade. The seed heads remain standing through fall and winter, feeding birds naturally, while also reseeding themselves into surrounding soil. One plant slowly becomes several. Then several become large, golden drifts of flowers spreading naturally through the landscape. That self-seeding behavior is one of the hidden secrets behind effortless-looking cottage gardens and meadow-style landscapes. The plants help build the garden themselves. Black-eyed Susans grow best in full sun with average, well-draining soil. But honestly, they are adaptable enough to tolerate conditions that would stress many other perennials badly. USDA hardiness zones 3 through 9 make them one of the most broadly reliable plants on this list. And maintenance is almost optional. Deadhead the flowers if you want slightly longer blooming, or ignore them completely and let nature handle everything for you. Either approach works, and emotionally, black-eyed Susans create something important in a garden. Optimism. They feel warm, bright, alive, like summer itself growing directly out of the soil. That is one reason people keep planting them generation after generation. Not because they are trendy, because they simply make gardens feel happy. Part 6. Sedum is what happens when a plant completely stops caring whether conditions are difficult. Hot blazing sun? Fine. Rocky dry soil? Perfect. Forgot to water for 3 weeks? Sedum barely notices. This is one of the toughest perennials you can possibly grow. And for busy gardeners, that is incredibly valuable. Because while many flowers collapse during summer heat, sedum often looks better the harsher the conditions become. There are 2 main types of sedum: low-growing, creeping varieties that spread between stones and along pathways, and upright forms like the famous autumn joy that create large sculptural flower heads standing 18 to 24 inches tall. Both are excellent low-maintenance choices, but autumn joy especially has one of the best seasonal transformations in perennial gardening. In late summer, the flower heads emerge soft, pale pink. Then they deepen gradually into rich rose-red tones during peak bloom, and by fall, they shift again into warm bronze and rust colors that remain standing beautifully through winter. Even after snow arrives, the dried flower heads continue adding structure and texture to the garden. That 4-season interest is one reason professional landscape designers rely on sedum so heavily. It keeps contributing long after many plants disappear. And because sedum is technically a succulent, it stores water directly inside its thick, fleshy leaves. That adaptation makes it exceptionally drought-tolerant once established. In fact, Overwatering is one of the few reliable ways to damage it. Sedum prefers lean, well-draining soil and full sun, where it can stay dry between watering cycles. Rich, wet soil often creates weak, floppy growth. Poorer soil creates stronger, healthier plants. That is the exact opposite of what many beginner gardeners expect. USDA hardiness zones 3 through 9 also make sedum reliable across an enormous range of climates, from freezing northern winters to hot, dry southern summers, and pollinators absolutely love it. Late-season bees and butterflies cover the flowers during late summer, when many nectar sources begin disappearing. That timing becomes extremely important for supporting pollinators heading into fall. Maintenance is almost laughably simple. One cutback in late winter or early spring, before new growth begins emerging. That is basically it. No constant deadheading, no fertilizer schedule, no complicated care routine, and visually, sedum works especially well beside ornamental grasses, black-eyed Susans, Russian sage, and coneflowers, where its heavier flower heads contrast beautifully against softer, airy textures. That balance creates gardens that feel layered and professionally designed without requiring professional-level effort, which is exactly the kind of gardening most people actually need. Part 7. Yarrow feels like a plant that belongs in nature more than in a garden. And honestly, that is part of its charm. It has the relaxed, effortless look of a wildflower meadow, while secretly being one of the toughest and easiest perennials you can grow. Flat clusters of tiny flowers rise above soft, fern-like foliage in shades of yellow, white, pink, red, peach, and cream. The blooms almost hover above the leaves, creating a light, airy texture that works beautifully in cottage gardens, pollinator gardens, and naturalistic landscapes. And once yarrow establishes itself, it becomes remarkably independent. Heat does not bother it much. Poor soil does not bother it. Drought barely slows it down. In fact, overly rich soil is often where problems begin. Too much fertility can make the stems floppy and reduce flowering. Yarrow actually prefers leaner conditions where many other flowers struggle. That is one reason it became such a legendary survival plant across difficult climates. It grows best in full sun with well-draining soil and is hardy across USDA zones 3 through 9, making it one of the most adaptable perennials on this entire list. And pollinators absolutely swarm it. Butterflies especially love the flat flower clusters because they provide an easy landing platform while feeding. Bees work the blooms constantly through summer. The entire garden feels more active when yarrow is flowering. But one of the hidden strengths of yarrow is how naturally it blends with other plants. It softens formal borders, connects larger flowering perennials together, and creates that relaxed, designed but not over-designed look that expensive gardens often have. It also dries beautifully. Cut the flowers at peak color, hang them upside down indoors, and they hold their shape and color for months. That gives yarrow value long after blooming season ends. And like many low-maintenance plants, yarrow slowly spreads over time, filling empty spaces naturally without demanding constant attention. Deadheading spent blooms can encourage additional flowering, but even that is optional. The plant performs beautifully with surprisingly little effort. And emotionally, yarrow changes the feeling of a garden in a subtle but important way. It makes landscapes feel older, softer, more connected to nature instead of perfectly controlled. That atmosphere is difficult to create with high-maintenance flowers that constantly need replacing. Yarrow brings a kind of relaxed confidence into the garden, like it was always meant to grow there. Part 8. Coreopsis looks like pure sunshine growing out of the ground. Bright golden flowers, constant color, endless energy, and somehow, despite blooming for an incredibly long season, it remains one of the easiest low-maintenance perennials you can grow. This plant is built for gardeners who want maximum color with minimal effort. Coreopsis, also called tick seed, produces masses of small, daisy-like flowers that seem to cover the plant non-stop from late spring all the way until frost. Not a few weeks, months. That bloom duration alone makes it incredibly valuable in the landscape because many flowers peak early and disappear quickly. Coreopsis just keeps going. And modern varieties now come in much more than simple yellow. There are warm oranges, rich golds, soft pinks, deep reds, beautiful bicolor combinations. But regardless of color, the effect always feels cheerful and energetic. This is a plant that instantly brightens a garden. It also thrives in conditions that frustrate many other flowers. Hot sun, dry weather, poor soil. Coreopsis handles all of it beautifully once established. In fact, too much fertilizer often creates weaker growth and fewer flowers. Like many tough prairie-style perennials, it actually performs better in leaner conditions, where the roots stay healthy and stable. That makes it ideal for low-maintenance gardens, roadside plantings, cottage gardens, and large sunny borders, where constant watering and feeding simply are not realistic. USDA hardiness zones 3 through 9 make Coreopsis adaptable across most of the country. And because many newer cultivars are self-cleaning, old flowers often drop naturally without requiring constant deadheading. That means non-stop color with very little work from you. Pollinators love it too. Bees and butterflies visit constantly during bloom season, bringing movement and life into the garden through the hottest part of summer. And visually, Coreopsis combines beautifully with plants like black-eyed Susan, yarrow, salvia, and ornamental grasses, where the bright flowers contrast against softer textures and cooler colors. That layering effect creates gardens that feel full and dynamic instead of flat. And emotionally, Coreopsis does something important. It keeps the garden feeling alive. Even during exhausting summer heat, when many plants start slowing down, Coreopsis continues throwing out fresh flowers almost relentlessly. That consistency changes the entire atmosphere of a landscape. The garden feels optimistic, bright, easy, like summer is still in full swing no matter how hot the season becomes. Part 9. Coneflower is one of those rare plants that manages to be beautiful, durable, and ecologically valuable all at the same time. And honestly, that combination is hard to beat. These tall, daisy-like flowers rise above the garden in shades of purple, pink, white, orange, yellow, and deep red, surrounding a bold central cone that gives the plant its unmistakable shape. Even people who know almost nothing about gardening usually recognize coneflowers immediately. They have become one of the defining plants of modern perennial gardens for a reason. They bloom for a long time, they survive difficult conditions, and they make the entire garden feel alive. Coneflowers thrive in full sun and tolerate heat, drought, poor soil, and inconsistent watering far better than most flowering plants. Once established, their deep roots allow them to handle dry periods with surprisingly little stress. That resilience makes them perfect for low-maintenance landscapes, where constant watering simply is not realistic. USDA hardiness zones 3 through 9 also make them one of the most widely adaptable perennials on this list. Cold northern winters, hot southern summers. Coneflowers handle both beautifully. And while the flowers themselves are stunning, what happens after blooming may be even more valuable. The seed heads, if you leave them standing through fall and winter instead of cutting them down immediately, birds begin feeding on them constantly. Goldfinches especially love coneflower seeds. Suddenly, the garden keeps supporting wildlife long after summer flowers disappear. That is one of the hidden secrets behind truly beautiful perennial landscapes. They continue functioning as ecosystems year-round, instead of existing only during bloom season. Pollinators absolutely swarm coneflowers too. Butterflies drift between the flowers all summer. Bees cover the blooms during warm afternoons. The garden gains movement and sound, and life almost automatically. And maintenance could not be much simpler. Deadhead for slightly longer blooming if you want, or leave the flowers alone entirely and let the plant reseed naturally over time. Either approach works beautifully. Coneflowers also pair incredibly well with ornamental grasses, black-eyed Susans, salvia, Russian sage, and yarrow, where their bold flower shapes contrast against softer textures and airy movement. That balance creates gardens that feel layered and natural instead of overly rigid or formal. And emotionally, coneflowers bring something important into a landscape. Wildness, not messy chaos, living movement. The garden starts feeling less like decoration and more like a real ecosystem quietly unfolding season after season. Part 10. Perennial salvia is one of the smartest plants you can grow if you want a garden that looks high effort without actually being high effort. Because salvia works hard for you. It blooms heavily. It attracts pollinators non-stop. It handles heat and drought beautifully. And if you prune it correctly, it often blooms twice in a single season. That is an incredible return from one perennial. Salvia nemorosa, the perennial type you want for long-term gardens, produces upright spikes of rich violet blue, purple, pink, or lavender flowers rising above dense, compact foliage. The color is intense, cool, saturated. It stands out beautifully against warm summer flowers like Coreopsis and black-eyed Susan. And because the flower spikes rise vertically, salvia also adds structure and rhythm to perennial borders in a way softer mounding plants cannot. But the real secret to spectacular salvia is what happens after the first bloom cycle finishes. Most gardeners stop there. Experienced gardeners cut the entire plant back hard after flowering fades. Not gently, aggressively. Within a few weeks, fresh foliage begins emerging from the base, followed by a second major bloom flush later in summer. 2 bloom periods from one plant. That alone makes salvia incredibly valuable in low-maintenance gardens, focused on long-lasting color. And pollinators absolutely adore it. Bees cover the flower spikes throughout the day. Butterflies drift through constantly. Hummingbirds visit repeatedly searching for nectar. The plant turns even small gardens into active pollinator spaces almost immediately. Salvia also happens to be remarkably drought-tolerant once established. It prefers full sun and well-draining soil, where the roots can stay relatively dry between watering cycles. Overwatering is actually one of the few reliable ways to damage it. Rich, soggy soil creates weak growth and root problems quickly. Lean, well-drained soil creates healthier, stronger plants. USDA hardiness zones 4 through 9 make perennial salvia dependable across most of the country. And because the aromatic foliage contains strong oils, deer and rabbits usually leave it completely alone. That alone can make salvia priceless in certain regions. And visually, few flowers combine with ornamental grasses, Russian sage, lavender, and coneflowers as naturally as salvia does. It acts like a visual connector inside the garden. Repeating cool, purple flower spikes throughout a landscape instantly makes everything feel more cohesive and professionally designed. And emotionally, salvia brings energy into a garden. Movement, pollinator activity, long-lasting color. The landscape feels active instead of static. That atmosphere is exactly what turns ordinary flower beds into gardens people genuinely remember. Part 11. Lavender is one of the few plants people recognize before they even see it, because the fragrance arrives first. Warm, herbal, clean. The smell alone can completely change the atmosphere of a garden. And once lavender begins blooming in summer, it creates that soft Mediterranean feeling people spend thousands of dollars trying to recreate in landscaping. But here is the surprising part. Lavender actually becomes easier to grow the less you interfere with it. Most beginner gardeners kill lavender by trying too hard. Too much water, too much fertilizer, soil that stays too wet. Lavender hates all of that. This plant evolved in dry, rocky regions with lean soil and intense sunlight. It wants conditions many other flowers would complain about immediately. Full sun, sharp drainage, dry soil between watering. Give lavender those conditions, and it becomes incredibly low maintenance. The silver-green foliage stays attractive for most of the year, and during bloom season, the purple flower spikes attract huge numbers of bees and butterflies, while also helping repel mosquitoes naturally around patios and seating areas. That combination of beauty and usefulness is hard to beat. And unlike delicate flowers that collapse during summer heat, lavender often thrives in it. The hotter and sunnier the location, the happier the plant usually becomes, as long as the roots stay well drained. English lavender, especially Lavandula angustifolia, is one of the best choices for beginners because it combines strong fragrance with better cold tolerance than many other varieties. USDA hardiness zones 5 through 9 are ideal, although colder regions can still grow lavender successfully with excellent drainage and winter protection. But drainage is everything. Heavy wet soil during winter kills more lavender than cold temperatures themselves. Raised beds, gravelly soil, and sunny slopes all help dramatically. And maintenance stays wonderfully simple. Light pruning after flowering keeps the plants compact and prevents woody overgrowth over time. That is usually enough. No constant feeding, no complicated care schedule, no obsessive maintenance routine. And visually, lavender combines beautifully with catmint, salvia, Russian sage, ornamental grasses, and stone pathways, where the cool purple flowers contrast against silver foliage and warm, natural textures. The entire garden begins feeling calmer and more relaxed. That emotional atmosphere may actually be lavender's greatest strength. It slows spaces down. The sound of bees moving through the flowers, the fragrance drifting through warm evening air, the soft movement in the wind. Lavender turns gardens into places people actually want to spend time in, not just look at from a distance. Part 12. Catmint is one of those plants that quietly makes everything around it look better. It softens edges, fills empty spaces, adds movement, brings pollinators into the garden nonstop, and somehow still asks for almost nothing in return. That balance is exactly why experienced gardeners use it everywhere. Catmint forms soft, flowing mounds of silver-green foliage covered in clouds of lavender-blue flowers that bloom heavily in spring and often return again later in summer with a simple haircut. The effect feels relaxed and natural, like the garden just happened to grow beautifully on its own. That effortless look is incredibly difficult to fake with high-maintenance plants, and one of catmint's greatest strengths is how versatile it is. It works along pathways, spilling over retaining walls, softening the edges of raised beds, filling gaps between larger perennials. Even when it is not flowering, the aromatic foliage still creates texture and structure throughout the landscape, and pollinators absolutely love it. Bees cover mature plants constantly. Butterflies drift through the flowers all season. The garden immediately feels more alive once catmint begins blooming. That pollinator activity becomes especially valuable when paired beside coneflowers, salvia, lavender, and black-eyed Susan, where the entire planting area starts functioning like one connected ecosystem. Catmint also happens to be remarkably forgiving. It tolerates drought extremely well once established. It handles poor soil. It thrives in full sun, but also tolerates partial shade surprisingly well. And unlike many flowering plants, it usually does not need fertilizer at all. Too much rich growth can actually reduce flowering and make the plant floppy. Lean soil keeps it healthier and more compact. USDA hardiness zones 3 through 8 make catmint one of the best long-blooming perennials for colder climates, where reliable color can sometimes be difficult to maintain through summer. And maintenance is refreshingly simple. After the first bloom cycle fades, shear the plant back by roughly 1/3. Within weeks, fresh foliage and another flush of flowers begin appearing. That repeat blooming ability gives catmint a much longer season of interest than many gardeners expect. There is also one entertaining side effect. Some cats absolutely lose their minds around it, rolling, sleeping in it, crushing sections of the plant with complete happiness. Honestly, it just makes the garden feel even more alive. And visually, catmint creates something important in landscaping: flow. Gardens filled only with stiff, upright flowers can feel rigid and over-designed. Catmint softens everything. It creates movement and calm at the same time. That subtle emotional effect is one reason the best perennial gardens almost always include plants with relaxed flowing habits like this. Part 13. Russian sage does not look like a plant that should survive difficult conditions. It looks too elegant, too soft, too atmospheric. Tall silver stems covered in clouds of lavender-blue flowers sway constantly in the wind, catching sunlight in a way that almost makes the plant glow during late summer evenings. But underneath that beauty is one of the toughest perennials on this entire list. Russian sage thrives where many other plants completely fail: hot, blazing sun, dry soil, wind, poor rocky ground, long periods without rain. This plant handles all of it with almost shocking ease once established. And here is the most important thing to understand about Russian sage. It actually performs better with a little neglect. Rich, heavily fertilized soil often creates floppy, weak growth. Too much water weakens the roots. This plant wants lean conditions and excellent drainage, where it can stay tough and upright naturally. That is why it became such a legendary performer in dry western landscapes and modern water-wise gardens. From midsummer well into fall, Russian sage sends up airy flower spikes that create movement and softness throughout the landscape. The effect is completely different from dense, heavy flowering plants. It feels lighter, more natural, almost dreamlike when the wind moves through it. And because the bloom season lasts for months, Russian sage continues carrying color long after many summer flowers begin fading. Pollinators love it too. Bees cover the flowers constantly during warm afternoons, bringing sound and movement into the garden through the hottest part of the year. At the same time, deer usually avoid it because of the aromatic foliage, making it especially valuable in areas where browsing animals destroy softer plants repeatedly. USDA hardiness zones 4 through 9 also make Russian sage reliable across a huge range of climates. Cold winters, hot summers, dry regions, humid regions. As long as the drainage stays good, the plant performs beautifully. And maintenance is almost laughably simple. One hard cutback in late winter or early spring before new growth begins. That is usually the entire yearly care routine. No staking, no constant pruning, no complicated feeding schedule. And visually, Russian sage combines perfectly with ornamental grasses, coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and lavender, where the silver foliage and airy flowers create contrast against stronger shapes and warmer colors. The entire garden immediately feels more layered and sophisticated. But emotionally, Russian sage brings something even more valuable: atmosphere. It changes how a garden feels when the light hits it in the evening. The movement, the texture, the silver haze drifting above the landscape. It creates the kind of beauty people usually assume requires constant maintenance. In reality, it is one of the easiest plants in the entire garden. Part 14. If flowers are the color of a garden, ornamental grasses are the movement. And no ornamental grass demonstrates that better than Karl Forster feather reed grass. This plant adds height, texture, motion, sound, and structure almost every month of the year, while asking for practically nothing in return. That combination makes it one of the most valuable landscape plants you can grow. Karl Forster forms tall, upright clumps, reaching roughly 4 to 6 feet high, with narrow vertical foliage that stays neat instead of flopping outward chaotically. Then in late spring, soft, feathery plumes begin rising above the grass. At first they appear green with hints of purple. By midsummer they turn warm golden tan. And by fall and winter, they become rich bronze columns that glow beautifully under low sunlight and frost. Even after snow arrives, the plant remains standing. That year-round structure is one of the reasons designers use this grass constantly in professional landscapes. Most flowers disappear after blooming. Karl Forster continues contributing through every season. And unlike aggressive spreading grasses that slowly try to take over the entire yard, this one grows in tidy clumps that stay controlled and predictable over time. That makes it much easier to integrate into long-term perennial borders. It also happens to be extremely low maintenance. Full sun is ideal, although it tolerates light shade surprisingly well. Once established, it becomes fairly drought-tolerant and rarely needs supplemental fertilizer. In fact, too much fertilizer can create weaker, floppier growth. Lean average soil usually produces the strongest structure. USDA hardiness zones 4 through 9 make Karl Forster adaptable across most of the country, handling cold winters and hot, humid summers equally well. And maintenance could not be simpler. One hard cutback in late winter or early spring before fresh growth begins emerging. That is it. One haircut per year. No deadheading, no staking, no complicated care schedule. But what truly makes ornamental grasses so powerful in landscaping is the emotional effect they create. Movement changes everything. When flowers stay still, the garden can sometimes feel flat. Grasses move constantly with the slightest wind. They catch morning light, glow at sunset, rustle softly in summer breezes. Even the sound changes the atmosphere of the garden completely. Carl Förster especially creates that elegant, naturalistic look modern designers love because it combines strong vertical structure with soft flowing motion at the same time. And visually, it pairs beautifully with Russian sage, coneflowers, sedum, black-eyed Susan, and yarrow, where the upright grass contrasts against broader flower shapes and softer mounding forms. That layering creates gardens that feel dynamic instead of static, expensive instead of accidental. And perhaps the best part is how little work it actually takes to create that effect once the right plants are in place. Part 15. Daylilies are the kind of plants that quietly survive everything. Old abandoned farmhouses, roadside ditches, neglected gardens nobody has touched in years. And every summer, somehow, they still bloom. That level of durability is exactly why daylilies became one of the most beloved perennials in America, because they make gardening feel easy. The flowers themselves are incredibly diverse. Bright orange, soft yellow, deep burgundy, pink, cream, rich red, even dramatic bicolor varieties with contrasting edges and centers. There are thousands of registered daylily cultivars available today, which means almost every gardener can find one that fits their style perfectly. And despite their elegant trumpet-shaped blooms, these plants are unbelievably forgiving. Full sun? Perfect. Partial shade? Still fine. Clay soil? No problem. Sandy soil? Also fine. Daylilies adapt to conditions that frustrate many other flowering perennials. That flexibility alone makes them incredibly valuable for real-world, low-maintenance gardens. And while each flower technically lasts only one day, the plant produces so many buds on each stem that blooming continues for weeks. One flower fades, another opens immediately behind it. Mature clumps become covered in waves of color through much of summer. The foliage matters too. Dense, arching leaves create thick clumps that naturally suppress weeds and fill space beautifully, helping the garden feel fuller and more established over time. And one of the biggest long-term advantages is how daylilies slowly multiply underground. Every few years, mature clumps become large enough to divide into several new plants. One original plant eventually turns into an entire border if you let it. That kind of long-term value is one reason older gardens often contain huge daylily colonies planted decades earlier. They just keep going. USDA hardiness zones 3 through 9 also make daylilies dependable across most climates, from freezing northern winters to intense southern summers. And maintenance stays refreshingly simple. Occasional division every few years. Basic watering during establishment. That is mostly it. No complicated pruning. No constant fertilizing. No obsessive care routine. But there is one important warning. Daylilies are toxic to cats, not dogs, not most wildlife. Cats specifically. So if you have outdoor cats or curious indoor cats near cut flowers, this is something you genuinely need to take seriously. And emotionally, daylilies bring something many gardens need more of: reliability. They return every year, bloom heavily, spread gradually, and continue performing beautifully even when life gets busy and the garden does not receive perfect attention. That dependable presence changes the way a landscape feels over time. The garden stops feeling fragile. It starts feeling established. Part 16. Creeping Phlox delivers the kind of spring color that makes people stop their car when they drive past your house. Because when this plant reaches peak bloom, the flowers become so dense, the foliage almost disappears underneath them completely. Hot pink, lavender, white, purple, magenta, entire slopes and borders suddenly explode into carpets of color that look far more expensive and high maintenance than they actually are. And that is exactly why gardeners love it. Creeping Phlox creates massive visual impact with surprisingly little effort. This low-growing perennial spreads outward into dense evergreen mats, that hug the ground beautifully, making it perfect for rock gardens, retaining walls, pathways, slopes, and difficult hillsides where erosion is a problem. Instead of fighting those awkward spaces, creeping phlox transforms them into some of the most dramatic parts of the entire landscape. And during spring bloom season, the effect can be breathtaking. The flowers spill over stone walls, cascade between rocks, flow across slopes almost like colorful waterfalls. It creates that intentional, professional landscape design feeling immediately. But even after the flowers fade, creeping phlox continues working for the garden. The evergreen needle-like foliage remains attractive through most of the year, while helping suppress weeds and stabilize soil naturally. That means the plant keeps contributing long after bloom season ends. It grows best in full sun with well-draining soil, where the foliage can stay relatively dry and healthy. USDA hardiness zones 3 through 9 also make it adaptable across most climates, especially in regions with cooler springs, where the bloom season lasts longer, and maintenance stays wonderfully minimal. After flowering finishes, a light trim helps keep the plant compact and encourages thicker growth. That is usually enough. No constant feeding, no complicated pruning schedule, no endless maintenance routine. And because creeping phlox spreads gradually outward over time, it slowly fills empty spaces naturally without becoming aggressively invasive. That balance is important. The plant feels generous without becoming overwhelming. Visually, creeping phlox pairs beautifully with stone, gravel pathways, ornamental grasses, and upright perennials, where the dense, low-flower carpets contrast against taller architectural shapes. That layering effect gives gardens depth and movement instead of everything sitting at the same height. And emotionally, creeping phlox creates one of the best moments of the gardening year. Early spring after a long winter, the first massive explosion of color, the feeling that the garden is fully alive again. Very few plants deliver that kind of emotional payoff so dramatically with so little effort. Part 17. The secret to a garden that looks expensive is not expensive plants. It is repetition. Most beginner gardens feel chaotic because every plant is different. One lavender here, one coneflower there, one random grass in the corner. Nothing visually connects together. Professional-looking gardens work differently. They repeat plants intentionally. 3 catmints along a pathway, drifts of black-eyed Susan repeating through a border, several ornamental grasses echoing the same vertical shape across the landscape. That repetition creates rhythm, and rhythm is what makes a garden feel designed instead of accidental. The second secret is planting by conditions instead of forcing plants where they do not want to grow. Shade plants in shade, dry-loving plants in dry areas, moisture lovers where water naturally collects. This sounds obvious, but most gardening frustration happens because people constantly fight their conditions instead of working with them. Hostas, astilbe, and liriope solve shade beautifully. Sedum, Russian sage, yarrow, and lavender thrive in hot, dry sun. Creeping phlox handles slopes and erosion naturally. Once the right plant matches the right location, maintenance drops dramatically. The garden starts cooperating with you instead of fighting you. Another huge difference between beginner gardens and mature, beautiful landscapes is layering. Tall plants in back, medium plants through the middle, lower spreading plants near edges and pathways. Ornamental grasses and Russian sage create height and movement. Coneflowers and daylilies fill the middle layer. Catmint and creeping phlox soften edges near the ground. That layering creates depth and makes even small gardens feel richer and more intentional. Mulch matters too. A simple layer of mulch suppresses weeds, stabilizes soil moisture, protects roots during temperature swings, and instantly makes garden beds look cleaner and more polished. It is probably the cheapest upgrade in landscaping. And perhaps the biggest mindset shift of all is this. Stop trying to make the garden perfect. Perfect gardens often feel sterile. Real, beautiful gardens feel alive. Let plants spread naturally. Allow a little softness. Leave seed heads standing through winter for birds and texture. Accept movement and seasonal change instead of trying to control every inch of the landscape constantly. That is where gardens begin feeling expensive and timeless instead of overly manicured. Because the truth is, most luxurious gardens are not built around perfection. They are built around atmosphere, movement in the wind, pollinators moving through flowers, layers of texture and color repeating naturally through the space. And once the right low-maintenance perennials establish themselves, the garden often becomes easier every single year instead of harder. That is the real beauty of smart perennial gardening. The landscape slowly learns how to take care of itself. Part 18. A few months from now, something unexpected is going to happen. You are going to walk outside one morning with coffee in your hand, and for the first time, the garden is not going to feel stressful anymore. It is just going to feel beautiful. The black-eyed Susans will be glowing in the morning sun. Bees will already be moving through the lavender and salvia. Russian sage will drift softly in the breeze. Karlfurster grass will catch the light and move with the wind. And somewhere near the edge of a pathway, catmint will probably have butterflies floating above it, like it has been there forever. That is the hidden magic of low-maintenance perennial gardening. The garden starts taking care of itself. Not completely, of course, but enough that it stops feeling like a constant, unfinished project hanging over your head. The plants return stronger every year. The borders fill in naturally. Pollinators come back automatically. The landscape slowly becomes more alive with less effort from you instead of more. And honestly, that is what most people actually want. Not perfection. Not a garden that looks like a full-time job. Just a space that feels calm, alive, and beautiful when life gets busy. So if you are overwhelmed by gardening, start small. Pick 3 plants from this list. Just 3. Put them in the ground this season and let them surprise you. Because once you realize how much beauty these plants give back for so little effort, your entire relationship with gardening starts changing. And before long, you stop seeing the garden as work. It starts feeling more like a place you genuinely want to spend time in. If this video helped you, subscribe, because every week we are building gardens for real people with real schedules, not fantasy landscapes that require endless maintenance. And before you go, tell me in the comments which plant from this list you would start with first. Honestly, I read every single comment, and some of the best gardening ideas come from people sharing what actually works in real yards. Now go get your hands a little dirty. Your future garden is waiting.